Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming along today on this event about supporting LGBTIQA plus refugees. We've got 4 fantastic speakers here today. And I mean, I'll let them introduce themselves, but I'm sure many of you will recognise their names anyway. So I'll kick off with Peter just because he's first on my screen. So if you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, Peter.
Hi, everyone. Very pleased to join you, and it's great for the Green Party to organise this panel. I've been campaigning for refugee rights for over 40 years. I think it was 41 years ago when I helped the first person to get asylum in this country, an LGBT plus refugee from Uganda. I think over the years, I've probably helped about nearly 1,000 people secure asylum in the UK, not just LGBTs, but also women fleeing patriarchal and sexist persecution, ethnic and political refugees, and those persecuted because of their faith or belief or non-belief. So well done to all of you, and let's keep up the fight to ensure that refugees are welcome here.
Absolutely. Yeah, Benali, would you be happy to go next?
Sure. My name is Benali Hamdache. I've been a Green Party member for 10 years. I'm currently a councillor in Highbury. I was former co-chair of the LGBTIQA plus Greens for, I think I've done 3 years over the 10 years at certain points. And yeah, did I say currently the Green Party spokesperson for refugees and migrants? So yeah, really happy to have this chat here today and to talk about the Greens' progressive policies. I think it's really important that we hold on to and foreground those, particularly when so many mainstream parties seem to be letting refugee rights fall by the wayside.
Absolutely. Rachel, you're next on my screen, so if you're happy to go next.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I'm the community representative for Time to Be Out. We're based in York, but in the north really, but we're in a few places. So we support LGBT asylum seekers and refugees. Often, if they've been, attacked and they get here, we can help them with English lessons. We can help them with phone credit, hopefully with a bit of money for food. As you all know, they don't have a lot of money, and sometimes they don't receive money at all. So we help them on a lot of things, and we've got an exciting project actually that's just been greenlit for funding from the National Lottery, expanding queer arts with LGBT refugees and help them in a number of ways. But yeah. My name is Rachel, if I didn't say it before, but I'm not as important as all of you.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Well, yeah, of course. And I mean, some fantastic work, and it'd be great to hear a bit more about Time to Be Out later on.
Mm-hmm.
Edward, you're next on my screen.
Hi, my name is Edward Rees. I'm speaking to you from Kyiv, Ukraine. I am part of Kyiv Pride, which is the most visible and one of the most prominent LGBTQ organizations in Ukraine. And also, I had an experience of being a refugee because of Russian aggression. I spent 7 months in Denmark. So maybe I will be able to speak on this also.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So I'm really sorry. I'm having quite a problem with my laptop, so I'm just going to temporarily leave. Ria, would you mind asking the first question, or if anyone has a question, if you pop it in the chat for any of the speakers?
Absolutely. Okay, so maybe if we can start off with some of your ongoing work, maybe, and some of the ongoing issues that are currently LGBTIQ plus refugees are facing here in the UK, but also maybe in other places around the world. I'm not sure who'd like to start off, but I guess free for all.
I don't mind starting, unless anybody else wants to. I think it's the culture of disbelief in the Home Office, I think, is what is such a big barrier. As I said, yeah, this culture of disbelief that it's so they want objective evidence of, you know, incidents that have happened in their home countries, you know, that might have happened to them. And of course, that's not always in reality. You might not be able to get that, you know, and especially if you go to perhaps the authorities are not the people that are going to help you either. So fighting the Home Office, I think, is one of the biggest issues. But yeah, please, someone else carry on from that.
Well, I was just going to chip in that, you know, we've gone from a bad place to worse. So under Theresa May, there were a lot of noises about making the kind system for LGBT plus refugees kinder and fairer, and a number of promises and reviews were made. A lot alongside, if anyone remembers, the LGBT Action Plan, which included things like the Gender Recognition Reform Act. But yeah, like many things under Boris Johnson and its successors, those promises and commitments have been torn up. And under Priti Patel, it became this Conservative Party's policy to make things worse for LGBTIQA plus refugees. So there's lots of pernicious, terrible things in the Nationality and Borders Bill, but there are a number of kind of measures that directly impact the refugees we're talking about. First of all, is the demand that all evidence is given when people first arrive. So this idea that unless you tell your entire circumstances right at the beginning, then future disclosures will be counted as less significant and maybe even against you. Now, there's lots and lots of reasons why people might not be at the first stage of encountering a Home Office staff member willing or able to tell every single part of their life story, particularly from the bundles of trauma, the cultural backgrounds, just building trust with staff members, that people potentially might not disclose something that then is later counted against them. So this system of disbelief is one that's existed for a while, but has been hardened and worsened under successive governments. I think also we start to have to look as well recently about the quality of staff that are being hired. I think there's been a rush to hire new Home Office staff members, but the level of training, the level of background and understanding that they're bringing, I think unfortunately is quite limited. And I think ultimately we are going to be seeing more and more cases dismissed on some very stereotypical and bigoted thinking about what makes an LGBTIQA plus person. And lots of the things that would help are actually made a lot more difficult. So what evidence is looked for is for living and authentically in your gender or sexuality identity. Well, how can you do that in a detention camp? How can you do that on poverty pay? How can you do that where you're stuck in maybe in the middle of nowhere where you can't live authentically or there's no community to connect with? So things on every front have been made so much worse. I'll not monopolize explaining everything that's wrong, but I'll just kind of say that as the spokesperson for the Green Party, definitely trying to work to articulate that. I've had some pieces in Pink News kind of specifically kind of highlighting the way the Nationality and Borders Bill will impact our community. And I think it's really important that we continue to make that voice. And I think, you know, the Tory party sometimes portrays, you know, LGBTIQA plus rights as something that's settled, that's done, the job's done, we'll move on. I think actually the treatment of refugees is something that we absolutely have to highlight. And we have to highlight the hypocrisy of certain MPs who will sit there behind a pride flag and then treat members of our community that way. And I think, you know, again, the Green Party and the Green Movement is brilliant at doing this all over the world, and we need to keep doing it.
if I may piggyback one thing as well, as you're saying about clarity, just very, very quickly, is that often there's a problem with, of course, language barriers and translation. And often what the Home Office is looking for actively is discrepancies in their story. Now, often they may not have a good translator, which means, or they might get a different translator the next time, which means there are discrepancies that are unforeseen in language. That means that they get penalized for the very fact of something that's not their fault at all. It's just something in translation that's been miscued, and they're then labeled a liar. They're not lying at all. It's the translator. So there's a lot of issues with that. And again, as you've said, with getting the right people, the right professionals, the right, the right translators, capable of doing this very sensitive work. But that's, anyway, I just wanted to piggyback off of that a little bit. So you're right.
Well, I can see Edward has his hand up, so I'm gonna, pass over to him. But absolutely.
Yeah, I actually wanted to address one thing. Kyiv Pride mostly works with people who are staying in Ukraine, but we also have several programs with helping to relocate to Canada. And me being a refugee temporarily myself, we have experienced one quite particular thing for Ukrainians. Why I'm saying this right now, because it goes right from the topic of translation, for example. The thing is that in different countries, I don't know how it works in the UK, but in different countries that I experienced, people in the authority very often mix up Russians and Ukrainians. As for, they give Ukrainians Russian interpreters, thinking that every Ukrainian knows Russian, but it's not true. Many of us don't, especially younger people. And also when they put Ukrainian refugees together with Russian refugees. And we know that right now there are a lot of people who are running from mobilization from Russia. They are not running from war, and they're running from their own government that they couldn't fight before. They didn't want to fight the government. So we also know several stories, for example, in France and Norway, when people who were soldiers of Russian army, they are running from persecution for their war crimes in Ukraine, and they are becoming refugees, political refugees. I know several particular people. So I would love to address this issue and ask you to work on it if it's possible in the UK and if you have these issues, because I know many people who are refugees from Ukraine in the UK right now, and I know that they could be working as interpreters if they were asked to interpret for Ukrainians in Ukrainian. For example, when I was in Denmark, I proposed to be an interpreter for Ukrainians, but my idea was declined. So I would love you to address those issues if it's possible.
If I can just sort of pick up off the back of that, it's true that the UK has given refuge to many people from Ukraine, but it's predominantly mothers and children and families, and much less LGBT plus people. Of course, some have got refugee status, but there is a bias definitely towards mothers, children, and families. It's also very shocking to note that this openness or relative openness to Ukrainian people fleeing persecution is markedly in contrast with the government stance on Afghanistan and Syrian refugees. So last year, the Afghanistan LGBT plus group Roshania and the Besht Collective, based inside Afghanistan, presented through me a list of 860 LGBT plus Afghans at imminent risk from the Taliban. They were being hunted and in hiding. They were vetted and confirmed as being LGBT plus and at risk. That was presented to the British government last February, and not a single one of them has been granted refugee status, not one. And we saw the same story during the Syrian war. Both LGBTs and political dissidents were often blanket refused asylum in the UK. So there's huge double standards and huge failings. Just going back to the specific issue of LGBT plus refugees, Benali is right that the government is exacerbating and intensifying the homophobic, biphobic policies. And we see that in lots of different ways, but some of them are just general. So for example, under new legislation being pushed through Parliament now, it's going to become a criminal offence to portray refugees crossing the channel in a positive light. This is absolutely outrageous. This is like the legislation of a fascist regime. On top of that, of course, the government still has not abandoned its Rwanda policy of deporting refugees to Rwanda, where we know that LGBT plus people have fled there and been granted asylum in the UK by the Home Office, which has recognised that Rwanda is unsafe for LGBT plus people. Otherwise, it wouldn't have granted them refugee status. On top of that, in a more general sense, just in the last week, one of the last independent journalists in Rwanda was murdered, died in mysterious circumstances, which almost certainly point to assassination, because he'd been under constant death threats from people linked to the government and far-right organizations in Rwanda. Just finally, in terms of current campaigns and other issues, well, they're long-standing issues. For example, my foundation, the Peter Tatchell Foundation, is working to try and end the detention of asylum seekers. No person who seeks asylum should be detained in an immigration detention center unless they have committed some kind of crime or have in other ways been identified as being a risk to the public. In 99% of cases, that is not the case. So there's no justification for them to be locked up after many of them have often fled imprisonment in their home countries because of their sexuality or indeed their ethnicity or political beliefs and so on. The other big issue is, of course, to end the ban on asylum applicants from working, from getting a job. It is absolutely absurd that we are paying refugees who are seeking asylum a miserly state handout of less than £40 a week to survive and not allow them to work when many of them have the skills that we need. So among the LGBT plus and other refugees that I'm helping, there are doctors, architects, plumbers, carpenters, farmers, building laborers. These are all assets to our economy. And if they were allowed to work, first of all, they have a better income and a better quality of life. And secondly, they would be contributing tax and national insurance and helping the exchequer. So these are just a few of the issues that are still very much outstanding.
Absolutely. And I mean, something that I think all of you have touched on is almost the deliberate design of a system that isn't designed to work or be in refugees' favour. I mean, just this week, we've seen stories about migrant children going missing. We obviously, as mentioned earlier, we have the Rwanda policy, which has not been dropped, efforts to move away from the ECHR and remove, really important protection for all refugees, especially LGBTIQA plus refugees, as well as, I think it was Peter or Benali who mentioned it earlier, the failure of the Afghan resettlement scheme. So for many of us, I'm sure we all share concerns and how we can continue to support LGBTIQA plus refugees. So one thing I did want to ask, with this system that isn't designed to work, how would you advise people watching now or people watching later to get involved with the kind of activism and work that you all do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most powerful way to break down this system of oppression is to tell people's stories. I think the biggest reason why the government feels empowered to make the policy decisions it does is because a systematic and society-wide effort to dehumanize and make abstract the suffering of these people. You know, whether that's the narrative and the discussions about the people crossing the channel, the language Suella Braverman talks about, invasion, you know, the response that she had to a Holocaust survivor, absolutely abhorrent. But actually, the work from that Holocaust survivor telling their story, saying why they supported a fair and equitable asylum system is so powerful. So I think sharing our platform with the lived experience of refugees going through or who've gone through the other end of the system, I think is incredibly powerful. And actually, you know, there are so many stories that I know that I think can help get people to understand why people are fleeing. I mean, I think about my own personal story, right? Like, I grew up in a very Muslim household. I was outed when I was 17. And in my house, I kind of experienced bullying and violence because of my sexuality. I had to pretend to be straight, and I had to kind of start praying, and then I was allowed to go to university. So that was my experience of being in that household and getting out of it. Now imagine the layers of not only having to escape your house, but having to escape your country and having to flee a very far distance under your own capacity and what resources that you have. And I can talk about how hard it was for me. I can only imagine how many times harder it is for someone trying to escape Syria or Afghanistan or Ukraine or all the other places that we've talked about today or haven't talked about. And I think getting people to think about those stories and put themselves in their place is the most powerful way to overcome the attitudes that we're seeing. I mean, I always talk about, you know, the impact that the gay rights movement had. And actually, you look at, I'm a psychologist by background, one of the fastest kind of social change, one of the fastest changes in attitude in society happened in direction to LGBT people. And that started with people knowing gay people in their life and people coming out and like the humanization of our community. And we need to do the same for refugees. And I think actually the intersection of refugees and LGBTIQA plus people is a really powerful story to start to break down those ideas that, you know, that, I mean, my mentions are a trash fire whenever I tweet about anything, but that hateful position has come from the massive amounts of dehumanization or the focus on very small negative stories. And so our most powerful tool in response is storytelling.
Yes, I'm Edward.
Yeah, I would love to add a little. That's a great idea. Storytelling, and actually, as Peter mentioned, there is a difference between how countries treat Ukrainian refugees and how they treat refugees from many other countries. And when I spoke about it with officials in Denmark, we came to an idea that actually the case of Ukrainian refugees who go to work when they are allowed, who go to learn the languages when they are allowed, and who use the things that you give to us and that you didn't give to Syrians or Afghani people, we use it and we are fine with it. So I hope that it's possible to show through the case of Ukrainians that if you give something to people, if you are kind to people, they will be kind to you back. So I think that there is one big difference as we talk about LGBTQ refugees. Ukraine doesn't prosecute LGBTQ people for anything. We don't have any homophobic laws or something like this. So there is kind of difference if we are talking about all those countries, Muslim countries. So I don't think that it applies to queer refugees, but it applies to all others, to every person who runs from the war. So I would be happy if you started to also give Ukrainians as an example of the refugees who are totally fine, and it means that others will also be fine if you give them the same circumstances and the same treatment.
Could I just pick up on your previous contribution, Edward, about Ukrainian LGBTs in the UK? I mean, I work a lot with the broad-based Ukrainian solidarity and community organizations, but I'm not aware of any Ukrainian LGBT plus organization in the UK. Is there one?
I don't know. I know that like many people, LGBTQ people from Ukraine are being refugees in the UK because of the Russian aggression.
Could I ask if you could perhaps contact them and ask if there is an Ukrainian LGBT plus organization? I know of individuals, but I don't know of any organization.
I could certainly look into that.
Yeah. Because I think it would be very, very helpful for Ukrainian LGBT plus people to have a voice here in the UK, to lobby for LGBT plus Ukrainians who need refuge or who are here and just need support. And I think on the New Year's Eve celebrations in London, I was wearing my Ukrainian badge, and a guy came up to me and said that he had got refuge here in the UK, but he didn't know any other Ukrainian LGBTs in the UK, and he was he came across as quite sad. So I think getting that connection going would be very good. The other point you made about interpreters, I don't know what qualifications are required for an interpreter. I presume there must be some kind of formal qualification. But what might be quite good is, again, if you know Ukrainians who would be willing and able to be interpreters, then perhaps they could contact their member of parliament and ask their member of parliament to write to the Home Office on their behalf. So if you can remember this, there's a very good website called writetothem.com, as in write, WRITE, to them.com. If your Ukrainian friends put their postcode into that website, it will tell them the name of their member of parliament and will enable them to directly email them. So it's a very effective tool. They can also lobby their MP about Ukraine issues as well, using that website. The other resource is Rainbow Migrants. This is the main LGBT plus immigration and asylum group. They might be able to help as well. So those are just two suggestions: writetothem.com and Rainbow Migrants.
Fantastic. I mean, that's hopefully something that, you know, will be really useful for LGBTIQA plus and other Ukrainian refugees to use. Something I wanted to ask Rachel was specifically, obviously you're from Time to Be Out, which is, as you say, a non-profit charity to help LGBTIQA plus refugee and asylum seekers. And a lot of the work you do is, as you have also mentioned, things like phone credit and providing warm clothes and money. So what kind of brought you into that role and that activism, and you know, what is your experience like?
Well, it's a bit weird, really, because I was a London bartender, you see. So I've been a career bartender all my life, cocktail bartender. Excuse my cat moaning in the background, by the way. So I was a career bartender. Essentially, what I did was get people drunk. Now I realised that I got stuck in a bit of a rut, and I realised we're making a party every day, but what are we celebrating? You know, when I see everything around me, I kept saying everything around me, and I kept reading, and I was just saying, what are we celebrating here? You know, there's nothing to say, there's things going on here. Why are we not paying attention? You know what I mean? And I just I think I just lost the magic of it all. And I completely moved, changed my life from London, went up to York, did my usual hospitality thing, and then met a gentleman called William and a gentleman called David who run Time to Be Out. And I happened to serve them their coffees and teas or whatever. And we got into conversation and what they do, and that the founder of Time to Be Out and everything, and what they do. And I just said, that's perfect. How can I be involved? I need to be involved immediately, and I'm going to devote my life to this. So whatever this just involve me. So that's essentially what I did. I haven't really looked back since. I've only been, it's been a few months, but so I'm really not as clued up and as knowledgeable as all of you, but I am certainly trying to get to grips with things, and try and see where I can be helpful, and getting things like warm clothes, talking to people. These are things that anybody can do, and I think that's really important. That sometimes you don't need, perhaps a lawyer's degree. My degree's in American studies, but you don't necessarily. I think a lot of people are scared of volunteering, or scared of it, and stuff like this, because they're worried they don't have anything to offer. But actually, everyone has something to offer for refugees, and especially LGBT refugees can be very isolated. And sometimes just being a friend is extremely important. So yes, it might be basic warm clothes and phone credits so they can call their lawyer, but these are basic things that we need. And especially they need, because they have nothing. And, I don't know how the Home Office expects them to sort of live or call lawyers or do anything if they don't have a phone, if they don't have a safe place to live, if they don't have any food because their benefits haven't come through, so these are very basic things that I think we try and cover. And yes, so that's how I got into it. Very bizarre story, but yeah, that's kind of how I fell into it.
I mean, a really, really inspiring story, and
Is it? I don't know.
I think so.
I hear inspiring stories every day. That's not me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And obviously, Peter, you have been a campaigner for many, many years and done some absolutely fantastic.
Which is wonderful. I'm a big fan over here. Yeah.
We're all fans. We're all doing our bit.
I'm a big fan. I'm fangirling out.
Like meeting a celebrity.
It is.
So Peter, obviously as a campaigner for a while, how have things gotten better for LGBTIQA plus refugees, and what key changes, be it in Home Office policy or culture around how we talk about refugees, would you like to see change?
Well, first of all, let me say that Benali is absolutely right that telling personal stories is a very important and powerful way to humanize refugees, all refugees, particularly those who are LGBT+. I think things are better than they were. There's no doubt about that. Some of you may know the barrister S. Chelvan, who has produced a guide or a template for how the Home Office should address and deal with LGBT+ asylum applicants. That has been rolled out, although it's patchy, and the actual implementation is very variable. Some asylum caseworkers follow it, others, pay lip service. So there's still a problem there. Certainly, I'd say that the number of LGBT+ refugees who are detained in detention centres has reduced, and the horror stories of homophobic, biphobic and transphobic abuse in those asylum detention centres has also reduced. So that's on the plus side. But of course, it's no consolation to those who are detained that they're still locked up. And of course, when you're locked up, you haven't got the access and freedom to compile the necessary evidence to support your application. If you're basically behind bars, how are you going to get all the witness statements, all the documentation that you need to confirm that you were at genuine risk or had actually experienced anti-LGBT+ persecution? So those are some of the positives, but I think the negatives are still so substantial that it's still, as we've heard already, it's still a huge hurdle to overcome basically the culture of disbelief that is prevailing in the Home Office. and the very onerous, demands for proof. I can remember a notorious case, which was actually handled by S. Shelvin some years ago, probably only about 7 years, maybe 8 years ago. A Ugandan gay man was initially refused because the love letters and other documentation and photos, the judge dismissed them, saying they were all faked and contrived in order to get asylum. So then this man, in desperation, produced a video of himself having sex with his partner. And for him, this is an incredibly traumatic experience, because he was a very private individual. He had very strong Christian religious beliefs, which do not square with, nakedness and nudity and sharing intimate moments with others. But he produced this video, and it was played by his barrister in court. And the adjudicator turned around and said, I've seen this video, but I note that when you are being penetrated, you don't have an erection. Therefore, clearly, you're not sexually attracted to men. And I therefore disallow your application for asylum based on your homosexuality. That is a true story. It was eventually overturned, but this poor guy had to go through years, and I think his application took, was it maybe 5 years to finally get heard. But that is perhaps untypical, but sort of gels with what we've heard about the culture of disbelief.
Absolutely. I mean, ridiculous that anyone would have to go through anything like that to prove, their right to remain. And Bethan has put in the chat, after years of erosion, we are now seeing the absolute collapse of the legal aid system. Legal representation is important for everyone, but particularly so in cases based on sexuality or gender identity. But calls to increase legal aid leads to press coverage of fat cat lawyers. How can we champion for an effective legal aid system? So I don't know if any of the panelists want to take up about how we can promote the need for legal aid and improving access to lawyers for LGBTIQA plus refugees.
I mean, it's quite troubling that we've got Suella Braverman in the Home Office, really, because she's been waging a war on lawyers following due process and legal process for quite a long time. There are a lot of myths about lawyers and barristers, and there's this idea that, there's loads of money swishing about. But I mean, we all know that there's lots of lawyers doing lots of different types of law that, aren't making enough money to make ends meet. And I think the fact that we saw people working out of work and going on strike was actually really powerful. And I think supporting the right to strike and helping people again tell their stories that, people are on the margins, people are struggling to get by. I think there's also just a really important argument to make about fair process. We have a legal system. There are steps that are meant to be pursued. Right-wing papers have portrayed those steps as, people taking the mick. But what kind of dystopian law system, particularly after, the case that Peter just highlighted, where if someone didn't have the right to appeal, a quite egregious legal error would have been made. And so, again, I think I'm going to go back to some of the rants before. I think storytelling is really important here. I think the right to strike and boosting and getting people's support and being on the picket line with people is really important. And I think there is just an overall narrative about the fact that the Conservatives have starved every sector of the society of enough funding so that nothing works right now. And I think actually a lot of people are waking up to the fact that nothing works right now anymore. Austerity for a very long time was balanced on the services that those most in need relied upon. And so for a lot of people, austerity for a long time was invisible for a large amount of the people. But I think everyone recognizes now, from the NHS to the legal system. I mean, another example is, the absolute awful experience that anyone has when they've experienced sexual violence. The backlog of cases, the law system that is unkind and unforgiving. I think there is a lot to be said about a better, well-resourced law system all over, and there's lots of stories to highlight how Tory cuts, Tory mismanagement is right at the root of this, and we just need to keep telling that story.
Absolutely. And on the theme of telling stories, I know, obviously, Edward, you do lots of work within Kiev Pride and have experience with NGOs, but something else you've mentioned in the bio you sent was about your experience as a TikTok educational blogger. And I was just wondering how the theme of telling stories about Ukrainian refugees feeds into that, and how social media can be used to highlight those stories and the disinformation spread around refugees.
I think that social media is kind of a main channel now, because even when people read some official media, they kind of not always believe them, because we have different biases and so on. So definitely TikTok or Twitter or other media who show the stories of people told by the people themselves. It's a very great channel. And when I was a refugee, I was speaking about how I am in Denmark, how everything works. And several people who were in Ukraine and who decided to, as myself, get out of Ukraine for some time, they listened to my stories, and it was the information for them to go to Denmark particularly. So and it's very important to show everything as it is, because social media storytelling, personal storytelling, has to be as true as possible, because when it's real stories, people always feel if someone is lying. So it's really important to show like the good things, the bad things, and definitely all those horrible negative things that you just described, the stories that you told, they definitely has to be shown.
Could I just add that, going back to the question about how we ensure there is legal aid, well, that is the huge battle that's going on. And you probably know that many legal people recently did a one-day strike to highlight the incredible lack of funding for the legal aid system, which is denying people justice. And that's the truth. It's actually denying people the right to be able to defend themselves. And this is, of course, a story that applies to LGBT plus refugees, but of course, many others who get caught up in the criminal justice system who cannot get funding to defend themselves. So yeah, we have to build a cross-party political coalition and a cross-civil society coalition of not just the lawyers and solicitors, but also, of course, LGBT plus groups, women's groups, Black and ethnic minority groups, all those groups whose rights are often under attack and who need the protection of legal aid to fight their cases.
Absolutely. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions for any of the panelists, do put that in the chat. I wanted to ask Benali, obviously you've shared some of your own experience and work you've done around supporting LGBTIQA plus refugees. I just wondered, you know, as a campaigner and the Green Party spokesperson on migration and refugees, you know, what is the key message around how the Green Party would be doing things differently to, you know, the language of Suella Braverman and how the Home Office is run? You know, what is the overall message?
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about a kinder and fairer system. You know, I think fairness is hopefully something that everything we can unify behind, and the idea that everyone deserves, you know, a fair hearing, a fair process, and one that is kind and respectful. So I think, you know, we'd start as a first point of scrapping and undoing a lot of the kind of changes that Suella Braverman has brought in. The Nationality and Borders Bill has to be scrapped, and a lot of these kind of pernicious bits in the process, whether that's demanding all evidence up front, or, you know, the lack of training and sensitive handling of cases, you know, I think we would reverse. I think also, I think really importantly, I think there's a narrative to talk about working together with our European neighbours to support those in need. Now, I'm old enough to remember that when the Syrian refugee crisis happened and European nations were talking about what they could do together to support those in need, one of the first politicians to say that they wouldn't be part of that was David Cameron. And actually, for too long, the British government have been on the side of people who don't see a European-wide solution to looking after those in need. And, you know, unfortunately, we do have a government right now that it seems like official policy is, well, France can take them all. And well, what happens when France says no? Or what happens when, I mean, European Union policy is already leaning towards the idea that people should be kept offshore in Libya and North Africa instead of reaching European shores. So to start to talk about a European-wide solution where European countries come together in solidarity to help those in need, I think is one of the most powerful ways to break down this idea. I mean, every right-wing party in every country argues that their country is the soft touch, and that's the reason why they're being taken advantage of. And one by one, they pick off countries with progressive policies and undermine the fundamental legal right for asylum. So, talking about European-wide solutions, talking about dismantling the Tories' attacks on process, adequately resourcing the system to make sure that people are given decisions in a fair time, in a fair process, ending detention, stopping people putting people in terrible conditions increasingly under Suella, and you know, finally, an emphasis on opening safe and legal routes. You know, the fact is that unless you come to this country, you can't claim asylum. I mean, you know, I think it was put to Suella Braverman really clearly that, say you're someone in Somalia looking for refuge, there is no safe authorized route for you to come to this country. You have to make your own way via quite often horrendous conditions. And so again, that also involves cooperation with the UNHCR. I think Canada is not perfect, but is a world leader comparatively on the way that they bring people to this country, particularly when it comes to gender and sexuality. I think we should be following best practice, working together, and absolutely foregrounding our demand for a kinder and fairer process.
Absolutely. I didn't know if Peter, do you want to pick up on that?
No, I think Benali's really said it all. You know, there are many different things we can do, and all of them add up to making change happen.
Absolutely. I'm aware we've got 7 minutes remaining today. So if any of the speakers, if there was anything else you wanted to share about your own work or about how people watching can get involved with similar work you do, if anyone has any kind of almost a closing statement, I suppose.
Well, I would just like to add that it is so hypocritical about the way we treat refugees here in Britain, because of course, when Britain had its hour of need during the Second World War, other countries, notably the United States and Canada, accepted British people, mostly children, who were sent there for safety from Hitler's bombs. You know, we were very grateful for those countries giving our kids refuge from the Nazis. Yet here we are when in Ukraine, for example, today, what's happening there is analogous to what the Nazis did in the 1940s to Ukraine. And yeah, we are responding there, but you know, when other parts of the world are under attack, often we just look the other way. So again, I reiterate Syria, you know, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's so many different places around the world where LGBT plus people are in dire risk of persecution and actually suffering. We need to step up to the plate. if it was good enough for other countries to give our kids refuge in the 1940s against Hitler, we should reciprocate.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. If anyone has any questions, this is probably your last chance to put them in the chat for any of the panelists today. I just want to reiterate thank you to everyone for coming along this Sunday and giving up an hour of your time and for sharing your words, your experiences, and you know, shining a light on LGBTIQA plus refugees. I, for one, have certainly really enjoyed hearing all the perspectives and messaging on things like the need to share stories, to uplift voices, and the need to move away from this very callous Home Office to a fairer and kinder system. So I do just want to say thank you to everyone for coming today.
Well, thank you for hosting.
Yes, thanks for organising.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can I just say, I'm sure we all join in sending our solidarity and love to LGBT plus Ukrainians.
Yes.
And your heroic national liberation struggle against Russian fascism and imperialism. Victory!
Absolutely.
Slava Ukraini! Slava Ukraini!
Slava Ukraini!
Heroям слава. Thanks a lot.